Studios.
Good evening. Our top story tonight. Residents across Wytheville and Wythe County are reporting a series of unusual sightings in the night sky. Over the past several days, multiple witnesses say they've seen bright, unidentified objects hovering low, moving silently, and changing direction in ways they can't explain. Local authorities confirmed they've received numerous calls, and while no official explanation has been given, the reports continue to come in. Tonight, many here are asking the same question. What exactly is being seen in the skies over Southwest Virginia?
In Appalachia, it gets dark, real dark. Once you get back in these mountains, light pollution becomes a distant memory. And it is said not to look up at the night sky when you have a funny feeling about you. But out here, folks are used to seeing things that don't always make sense. Shadows moving where they don't belong. Lights in the distance that may or may not be that of a neighbor. Or maybe it's something you just write off and pretend like you never even saw it at all. But every now and then, something shows up that even the people who spent their whole lives here can't explain. And in 1987, in the Appalachian town of Wytheville, Virginia, something like that began to happen. What started as a few reports turned into weeks of sightings, hundreds of calls, and before long, it would draw attention from far beyond these mountains, bringing cameras, reporters, and visitors into a town that wasn't used to any of it. And somewhere along the way, two well-dressed men showed up, asking questions, claiming to be someone they weren't. And at the center of it all, one man's life would never be the same. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday, and if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. When I'm getting ready for an episode, I took a drive. I went to Wytheville and out into parts of Wythe County, and I went at night. I wanted to see it the way the people in this story would have seen it, to get a feel for what it was like standing out there, looking up at that same sky. And what I found, doing this over and over again, visiting these parts of Appalachia, is that when you go somewhere with a purpose, no matter how many times you've been there, you start to really see it. Not just pass through it, not just drive by it, but actually take it in. Noticing the shops and the streets, the old homes, the old churches, and just the natural beauty. And once again, I was reminded of something. It's not that these places are hiding anything. It's that most of the time, we're just not really looking. Wythe County sits in the southwestern part of the state, a place shaped by mountains, valleys, and a long stretch of history that goes all the way back to 1790. Named for George Wythe, a mentor to Thomas Jefferson and one of the first signers of the Declaration of Independence. It's a large county, bigger than most people realize, with two major interstates, I-77 and I-81, cutting right through it, carrying thousands of travelers through these mountains every single day. Right at the crossroads sits Wytheville, the county seat, a town of around 8,000 people. Not small, but not large either. This is where Edith Bolling Wilson was born, a woman who would later find herself at the White House beside Woodrow Wilson when she was First Lady, and for a time became known as the Secret President after stepping in to manage affairs when her husband suffered a stroke. And outside of town, the county opens up. Mountains, farmland, trails that stretch for miles, even parts of the Appalachian Trail running along the ridges. The kind of place people come to relax, for space, for the outdoors. But it doesn't take much to step away from the road and find yourself somewhere still, somewhere dark enough, quiet enough to notice when something isn't right. Because this is a place where people are used to knowing what they're looking at. And in 1987, something showed up in those skies that they couldn't explain. Now, to understand what was happening in 1987, you've got to step back a little bit, because stories about things in the sky, they didn't start in Wythe County. For most of American history, people didn't talk much about unidentified objects in the sky at all. That really didn't change until June 1947. That's when a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state, when he reported seeing a group of bright objects moving across the sky, faster than anything he'd ever seen before. He described the way they moved, like a saucer skipping across water. And that one description is where the term flying saucer came from. From that point on, the reports started to grow. People from different parts of the country, different walks of life, all describing things they couldn't quite explain. Then there was the incident in Roswell, New Mexico, in July of 1947, where the military was called in to examine what was left of an unknown aircraft crash. And then, one of the most well-documented was in 1952 and happened in the skies over our nation's capital. In July 1952, a series of unidentified flying objects were tracked on radar and seen by pilots and air traffic controllers over Washington, D.C., even appearing directly above the White House and Capitol. The objects performed maneuvers that defied physics at the time, leading the Air Force to scramble interceptor jets twice. The military ultimately dismissed the event as a temperature inversion, causing radar glitches, but the incident caused such a massive public frenzy that it led to the government's first major efforts to publicly debunk UFO sightings, with the creation of the Robertson Panel. And according to declassified reports of that panel, its objective was to evaluate UFO reports from a national security standpoint. The goal wasn't to figure out what those objects were, it was to understand whether they posed a threat, and what impact all these reports might have if they continued to grow. Also, by that point, these sightings of unexplained things in the sky had increased enough that the U.S. Air Force decided they needed to take a closer look. And in 1952, they created a top-secret operation codenamed Project Blue Book, with one main purpose: to investigate these sightings, determine whether they posed any kind of threat to national security, and explain the sightings. Led primarily by two men, a civilian astrophysicist, Dr. Allen Hynek, and Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt, who had been cited with coining the term UFO, unidentified flying object. Now, when people hear UFO, they tend to jump straight to something from somewhere else, outer space, and extraterrestrial. But the truth is, it just means something that was seen in the sky that hasn't yet been explained. Over the next 17 years, Project Blue Book would look into more than 12,000 reported sightings, and one of their most notorious cases being just a couple hours away in Flatwoods, West Virginia. Most of the sightings, they said, had explanations: weather balloons, aircraft, atmospheric conditions, things like that. But not all of them. A small number were left unexplained. And even though the program officially shut down in 1969, the questions of what people saw in the skies has never really went away. If anything, they've kept growing. Because at the same time all this was happening, something else was taking hold in American culture. Movies, such as The Day the Earth Stood Still and The War of the Worlds, television shows, science fiction stories, all starting to paint a picture of what these things might be. The idea of visitors from somewhere else, little green men, flying crafts moving through the sky, it all started to settle into the public imagination. And over time, the line between what people actually saw and what they believed they might be seeing started to blur. So by the time you get to the 1980s, people were already familiar with the idea. They'd heard the stories, seen the movies, read about sightings in other parts of the country. But hearing about something and seeing something for yourself are two very different things. And in 1987, in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, that difference started to matter in Wythe County. October 7th, 1987, started out like any other morning, and at a country music radio station in Wytheville, Virginia, a local newsman by the name of Danny Gordon was doing what he always did, checking in on the day's news. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary, just a routine call over to the sheriff's office. The kind of call he'd made countless times before. But this one was different, because on the other end of that line, he was told something he didn't quite know what to do with. Several officers, men with military backgrounds, were reporting that they had seen something the night before, something in the sky they couldn't explain. Even then, it didn't feel like a big story. To Danny, it was just another unusual report, something you might mention at the end of the news before moving on to the next thing. And that's exactly what he did. Something unusual, maybe even a little strange, but nothing you'd build a story around. At least, that's what he thought. So he put it on the air, just a short piece. Something unusual reported over Wythe County. And then he moved on. But across the county, people didn't. Because over the next few days, more and more folks started to come forward. People from different roads, different towns, different parts of the county, all describing the same kind of thing. Lights in the sky, moving slow, moving low, not making a sound. Some saw them out over open fields, some above their homes, some just catching a glimpse as it passed over the ridge. And the more it was talked about, the more people started paying attention, looking up, watching a little longer than they normally would. And it wasn't just something one person saw. It was something that a whole lot of people did. And like it tends to do in places like this, word began to travel. Danny was still there, still taking the calls, still trying to make sense of it. As the days goes on, the calls had never really stopped. But now they were coming in faster than anyone at the station could keep up with. What seemed significant was folks around here don't always pick up the phone and call into a radio station. They don't go looking for attention. They don't go out of their way to make something into more than it is. Most of the time, if you see something you can't explain, you keep it to yourself. Or maybe mention it to a neighbor and let it go, mainly for the fear of what you think people might think of you. And after nearly 2 weeks of phone calls, Danny opened up the phone lines and went live. And this was people telling it themselves, in their own words, in real time, live on the air. They tried to explain what they saw, but it wasn't easy putting something like this into words. One caller describing something large, long, stretching across the sky, with lights spaced out along it, front to back. Another saying it looked almost egg-shaped, something solid, but not like anything they recognized. Someone else talking about lights, red, green, white, flashing in a way that didn't match any plane they'd ever seen. And over again, the same detail kept coming back. No sound, or almost none at all. Because in Appalachia, you usually hear things before you see them. A plane, you hear it coming. A helicopter, the chopping sounds resonates to your ears before it's seen. But this, whatever it was moving through the sky without giving itself away. And as those calls kept coming in, one after another, anyone listening could hear it for themselves. This wasn't one story. It wasn't one sighting. It was something happening across the county, in different places, to different people, all at the same time. And once that was out there, once people heard their neighbors, their community, saying the same thing, something took hold. Because now, it wasn't just something you heard about. It was something you started looking for. And the more people looked, the more they began to see. And as all those calls continued to come in, there was still a question hanging over all of it. What exactly were people seeing? As all of this was building, it wasn't just the people of Wythe County asking questions. Local officials were hearing about it too. And before long, those questions started moving beyond the county, reaching state and federal representatives who began looking into what was being reported. Because from the beginning, the assumption was simple. There had to be a straightforward explanation. At one point, attention turned toward the military, as the Associated Press ran a story, after interviewing a sergeant with the Tennessee Air National Guard. The sergeant suggesting that what people were seeing was simply aircraft from his unit involved in mid-air refueling operations, lights moving and shifting in ways that might look unusual from the ground. And on paper, that made sense. But for many of the people who had seen it for themselves, that explanation didn't quite line up with what they were describing. For nearly 2 weeks, Danny Gordon had made a very deliberate decision. As a journalist, he wanted to stay objective and report on what others were seeing without letting himself become part of the story. So, he avoided going out and looking up into the night sky altogether. And that kind of restraint isn't easy, especially when you're getting call after call from people across Wythe County describing something they can't explain. But it does tell you something about how seriously he took his role in all of this. But on the night of October 21st, 1987, after nearly 2 weeks of hearing those same kinds of reports come in, he decided it was time to go out and see for himself what, if anything, was actually happening. He didn't go alone. A friend of his, Roger Hall, went with him. And like most people would in that situation, they brought a camera along, just in case they were able to capture something that could help explain what so many others had been describing. So they drove out along Route 21, heading into areas where most of the sightings had been reported, moving away from the lights of Wytheville and into the less inhabited parts of the county, where the skies open up a little more and you can see a lot further. They stayed out there for a while, watching and waiting, but for the first couple of hours, nothing happened. And it started to feel like just another quiet night, the kind you'd expect in that part of the world. Eventually, they decided to head back, and as they were coming back towards town, not really expecting to see anything at that point, something caught their attention off to the side, low on the horizon. At first, it was just lights, something moving where nothing should have been moving. But as they watched, it became clear that this wasn't just something passing by at a distance, because it was getting closer. What they were looking at was very large, far larger than anything they had expected, moving steadily across the sky without the kind of sound you would normally associate with an aircraft. It was close enough that they could begin to make out the details, and that's when it stopped being something distant and became something they were actually standing there watching. As the object came towards them, Danny said he was able to make out details that made it even harder to explain. He described what looked like a flat, almost snub-nosed cockpit at the front, something defined enough to recognize as a front-facing section, but unlike anything he had ever seen on an aircraft. One side of it was lit up in a glaring white light, bright enough to stand out clearly against the night sky, while the other side remained completely dark, creating a contrast that didn't seem to make sense. At the front of the craft, there was a strobe light, but it wasn't a standard aviation light. It was giving off multiple colors, shifting and flashing in an unusually unique way. And what stood out just as much as what they could see was what they couldn't. There were no wing lights, no rotor blades, nothing that matched the shape or structure of any conventional aircraft. As it moved alongside them, the overall form began to come into view more clearly, and he said it appeared to take on a dome-like shape, something rounded rather than angular, smooth rather than mechanical in the way you would expect. And then, as it started to move away from them, they saw what he would later describe as the strangest part of it all. Along the back of the craft were 3 large window-like panes, arranged in a half circle, almost like the curve of the dome itself. They weren't bright or harsh, but instead gave off a soft, steady glow, the kind of light you might see coming from inside a house at night, something closer to a warm bulb than anything industrial. He estimated the size of the craft to be somewhere in the range of 600 to 700 feet across, and then, as they stood there watching it move away, something else entered the scene. From the east, a red spherical object came into view, moving much faster than the larger craft, crossing the sky with purpose, not drifting, but traveling in a direct path. It appeared solid as it moved, blocking out the stars behind it rather than simply shining through them. But the sphere and the larger craft moved into the same cloud at nearly the same time. But when the larger object came back out, the sphere didn't. And in that moment, everything they had planned, the camera, the reason they'd come out there in the first place, all of it seemed to fall away, because instead of thinking about documenting what they were seeing, they were just standing there trying to process it. By the time they realized they hadn't taken a single picture, it was already too late. Whatever it was gone. The next night, he went back out. After what he had seen along Route 21, there was no real question about it. Whatever was happening out there, it hadn't been a one-time thing, and if there was a chance to document it, he wasn't going to miss it again. This time, they were ready, cameras in hand, paying closer attention, watching the sky with a different kind of focus than the night before. Not just curious anymore, but intent on capturing something they could bring back. And before long, it happened again. Lights in the sky, similar to what had been described, and similar to what he had seen the night before, moving in ways that didn't quite line up with anything familiar, shifting and changing in ways that made it difficult to pin down exactly what it was. But this time, they got pictures, or so they thought. Danny would later say the picture showed only vague streaks of light. A press conference was scheduled by Danny for October 23rd. Something that had started as a short mention at the end of a local broadcast was about to be put in front of a much larger audience. But before that could happen, something else started to unfold. The night before the press conference, Danny received a phone call. No name, no identification, just a voice on the other end telling him that, according to the caller, the CIA and the federal government were paying close attention to what was happening in Wythe County, and that he needed to be careful. At first, it may have sounded like just another strange call, something you might dismiss and move past, but it didn't stop there. More calls followed, some of them vague, some of them more direct, all of them carrying the same message in one way or another, that this was something that he should leave alone. And then, not long after that, his home was broken into. Nothing valuable taken, nothing disturbed in a way that made sense for a normal break-in, just a feeling that someone had been there, and they had been looking for something specific. The break-in was investigated, but with nothing stolen and no indication of who had come and gone, it left more questions than answers, and very little for anyone to follow up on. Later on, Danny said 2 men showed up at his home. They were well dressed, polite, said they were reporters working on a story about what had been happening in Wytheville and the surrounding areas of Wythe County. At first, there wasn't anything unusual about it. By that point, people were starting to take notice. Reporters had begun to show interest, and it didn't seem out of place that someone would want to come by, ask questions, and see what he had documented. So, he let them in. They sat down, asked about the sightings, about the calls, about what he had seen for himself, and for a while, it felt like any other interview. But something about it didn't quite sit right. While one of the men stayed focused on the conversation, asking questions and taking notes, the other moved around the house, looking at things, taking photographs, paying close attention to areas that didn't seem to have much to do with the story itself. They stayed for a while, long enough to get what they said they needed, and before they left, they told him they would be in touch, and that they would send along a copy of whatever they had published. And then they were gone. At the time, it may have seemed a little odd, but not enough to make a big deal of it. But days passed, and nothing came. No article, no follow-up, nothing at all. So he decided to check. He contacted the newspaper they claimed to be with, and that's when he found out they didn't work there. No one by those names. No record of them being sent. Nothing to connect them to that paper at all. Which meant those 2 men, whoever they were claiming to be, had come into his house, asked questions, taken photographs, and left, without ever saying who they really were. Not long after that, things didn't settle down. If anything, they kept building. The calls didn't stop, not completely, and the attention around what was happening in Wythe County continued to grow. But now, there was something else mixed in with it. Something harder to explain. At some point, Danny began going back through the photographs he had taken, trying to make sense of them, organizing what he had, looking closer at all the details, maybe hoping that something would stand out that hadn't before. And that's when he noticed it. He said that one set of negatives was gone. Not misplaced, not mixed in with something else, just missing. Out of everything he had taken, it was a specific set, ones from a night near a shopping center, ones that had shown multiple shapes, changing form, one frame to the next. And he could not explain why those, and only those, would be gone. He went back over everything, checking where they should have been, retraced his steps, but there wasn't an answer waiting for him. There had already been the phone calls, the warnings, The break-in, the two men who weren't who they said they were. Each one on its own, you might explain away, but taken together, it started to feel different. Gradually, the weight started to build, not just around the story, but on him. Because this wasn't something he could just step away from easily anymore. It had followed him home, into his work, into his family life, into the quiet parts of his day where none of this was supposed to reach. And eventually, it caught up with him. By the summer of 1988, it had built up to the point that he had to be taken to the hospital, and after being treated and observed, he was later discharged with conditions brought on by stress, not eating, and not sleeping, and exhaustion. And for someone who had started out just trying to report what people were seeing, that moment says a lot about how far this had gone. Even with all that, his work didn't go unnoticed. He was recognized for his reporting, acknowledged for the way he handled the story, and later he chose to write about it, putting his experience into a book in an effort to document what had happened and what it had been like to be at the center of it all. The book titled Don't Look Up, which I read in preparation for this episode. And even years later, the story didn't disappear. In the early 1990s, the popular television show Unsolved Mysteries came to Wytheville and revisited what had taken place, speaking with the people who had been there and bringing the story to a national audience. And now, people across the country were hearing about these sightings, trying to understand the same way the people here had years earlier. Trying to understand how, by Danny's count, the calls and sightings numbered into the hundreds, with some later accounts putting the total well over 1,000 by that year's end. While working on this episode, I was able to track down a few people willing to talk about their experiences during these Wythe County UFO sightings, what's often called a flap, a surge in sightings over a short period of time. Some even shared recent pictures and videos with me. One man, who asked to only be identified by his first name, Roland, said he recalled his sighting vividly. It was a Thursday night, weeks prior to the first news report. He said he was listening to a radio, and interference came across it, and that he could hear something, too quiet for a jet engine, and when he looked up, he saw it, going across the sky. He said it was moving slow, at helicopter speed, but no choppy helicopter sound. He said it was only about 200 feet off the ground, and had no visible outline, no navigational lights. He said it was obviously there, because you could hear it and see it. He said he didn't mention the incident until others started coming forward. He recalled another incident, out in the county, while flying a kite. He said he noticed a group of silver triangle-shaped objects about a mile away, appearing to spin and flip, and a little while later, 4 fighter jets showed up, and then the objects disappeared. He said he attributed his sightings to nothing more than the military performing training operations. And Wythe County is not the only Appalachia areas that has seen unknown things in the sky. Similar reports have appeared in neighboring Smith and Grayson counties, specifically in the Saltville and around the Mount Rogers and Whitetop sections of the counties. Danny, who had gone on to finish his career at the radio station, eventually retired, but recently has returned to the radio. I was able to catch up with him and share a brief conversation about his experiences. Maybe in the future, we can reconnect and dive deeper into his story. And still, the questions remained. Official explanations had been given. Aircraft, refueling operations, something grounded, something that fit within what we already understand. And for some people, that was enough. But not for everyone. Because for the ones who stood out there and watched it, the ones who saw something move across the sky in a way they couldn't explain, something too large, too quiet, too different from anything they had seen before, that answer wasn't convincing. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Not whether it was fully explained, but the fact for a period of time, in a place where people are used to knowing what they're looking at, something showed up that they couldn't quite explain, and never really forgot. Because in Appalachia, People may not always talk about what they've seen, but they don't forget it either. And as a note, my inquiry to the Air Force about this event went unanswered, and my search through the recently declassified government documents regarding UFO, or UAP, Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, as it is now called, returned the results for the Wythe County incident. And if you're wondering if I've ever seen anything that I can't explain to these Appalachian skies, of course I have. But I've always attributed it to military aircraft and satellites. In 2021, I took a road trip with my family out west, and on that trip, I made it a point to try to find the back gate of the infamous Area 51 in Nevada. Area 51 is a top-secret U.S. Air Force facility that the government denied even existed until 2013. It was originally built in 1955 by the CIA to test the U-2 spy plane. We stopped just outside of Rachel, Nevada, population 48, the closest community to Area 51, just off what's called the Extraterrestrial Highway, and spoke with a local who had lived there her whole life. She gave me directions to the back gate, and I asked her what it was like growing up around there. She said they were constantly seeing things in the sky, but they never really thought anything about it. They constantly heard and saw things, and just never paid much attention to it. It was just part of life, part of growing up around there. She said that was until she was a young girl in the 1990s and things changed. That's when Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode about Area 51 and mentioned their community by name and what was supposedly going on there. She said that scared her to death, but up until then, they had never really talked about it. It was just there. So I followed her directions, turned off the asphalt, and drove miles and miles on a gravel road through nothing but desert. Then all of a sudden, strangely, the gravel turned back into asphalt. A few miles later, in the middle of nowhere, I came up on a gate. It was closed, with cameras, sensors, lights, and a few buildings off in the distance. There was even one of those white, unmarked pickup trucks parked just on the other side, the kind people say belong to the camo men. There were signs posted everywhere, basically telling me that taking photos was prohibited and that trespassing would have severe consequences. So, it does exist. I saw it. But was it worth the 2-hour drive to get there? I guess that depends on who you ask. And while we were traveling through the barren desert, in the middle of the day, with miles of nothing but long, straight stretches of highway, no cars, no houses, all eyes were on the sky. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, 2 aircraft appeared. The whole car started yelling, "I see them! I see them!" They looked like some kind of military aircraft, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. Maybe some kind of next-generational aircraft, flying low and fast. I watched it as it approached the mountain range and thought to myself, they'd better pull up. And then, just as soon as that thought crossed my mind, they were gone. I turned to everyone in the car and said, "Don't say anything. I want all of you to say at the same time what you just saw." And all 6 of us said the exact same thing. We had just watched 2 aircraft fly straight into a mountain and disappear. This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.